Gorgias by Plato, translated by Donald J. Zeal. Part 4. Callicles continued.
Now, is it for every man to pick out which kinds of pleasures are good ones and which are bad ones, or does this require a craftsman in each case? It requires a craftsman. Let's recall what I was actually saying to Polus and Gorgias. I was saying, if you remember, that there are some practices that concern themselves with nothing further than pleasure and procure only pleasure, practices that are ignorant about what's better and worse. Well, there are other practices that do know what's good and what's bad. And I place the knack, not the craft, of pastry baking among those that are concerned with pleasures, and the medical craft among those concerned with what's good. And by Zeus, the god of friendship, Callicles, please don't think that you should jest with me either or answer anything that comes to mind, contrary to what you really think, and please don't accept what you get from me as though I'm jesting. For you see, don't you, that our discussion about this, and what would even a man of little intelligence take more seriously than this, about the way we're supposed to live, is it the way you urge me toward, to engage in these manly activities, to make speeches among the people, to practice oratory, and to be active in the sort of politics you people engage in these days? Or is it the life spent in philosophy? And in what way does this latter way of life differ from the former? Perhaps it's best to distinguish them, as I just tried to do. Having done that, and having agreed that these are two distinct lives, it's best to examine how they differ from each other, and which of them is the one we should live. Now perhaps you don't yet know what I'm talking about. No, I certainly don't. Well, I'll tell you more clearly. Given that we agreed, you and I, that there is such a thing as good and such a thing as pleasant, and that the pleasant is different from the good, and that there's a practice of each of them, and a procedure for obtaining it, the quest for the pleasant on the one hand, and that for the good on the other, give me first your assent to this point, or withhold it. Do you assent to it? Yes, I do. Come then, and agree further with me about what I was saying to them, too, if you think that what I said then was true. I was saying, wasn't I, that I don't think that pastry baking is a craft, but a knack, whereas medicine is a craft. I said that the one, medicine, has investigated both the nature of the object it serves and the cause of the things it does, and is able to give an account of each of these. The other, the one concerned with pleasure, to which the whole of its service is entirely devoted, proceeds towards its object quite inexpertly, without having at all considered either the nature of pleasure or its cause. It does so completely irrationally, with virtually no discrimination. Through routine and knack, it merely preserves the memory of what customarily happens, and that's how it also supplies its pleasures. So consider first of all whether you think that this account is an adequate one, and whether you think that there are also other similar preoccupations in the case of the soul. Do you think that some of the latter are of the order of crafts and possess forethought about what's best for the soul, while others slight this and have investigated only, as in the other case, the soul's way of getting its pleasure, without considering which of the pleasures is better or worse, and without having any concern about anything but mere gratification, whether for the better or for the worse? For my part, Callicles, I think there are such preoccupations, and I say that this sort of thing is flattery, both in the case of the body and that of the soul, and in any other case in which a person may wait upon a pleasure without any consideration of what's better or worse. As for you, do you join us in subscribing to the same opinion on these matters, or you dissent from them?
No, I won't dissent. I'm going along with you, both to expedite your argument and to gratify Gorgias here. Now, is this the case that one soul only, and not with two or many? No, it's also the case with two or many. Isn't it also possible to gratify a group of souls collectively at one and the same time, without any consideration for what's best? Yes, I suppose so. Can you tell me which ones are the practices that do this? Better yet, if you like, I'll ask you, and you say yes for any which you think falls in this group, and no for any which you think doesn't. Let's look at flute playing first. Don't you think that it's one of this kind, Callicles, that it merely aims to give us pleasure without giving thought to anything else? Yes, I think so. Don't all such practices do that too? Lyre playing and competitions, for example? Yes. What about training choruses and composing dithyrambs? Doesn't that strike you as being something of the same sort? Do you think that Synesius, the son of Meles, gives any thought to saying anything of a sort that might lead to the improvement of his audience, or to what is likely to gratify the crowd of spectators? Clearly the latter, Socrates, at least in Synesius's case. What about his father Meles? Do you think he sang to the lyre with a regard for what's best, or did he fail to regard even what's most pleasant? For he inflicted pain upon his spectators with his singing. But consider whether you don't think that all singing to the lyre and composing of dithyrambs has been invented for the sake of pleasure. Yes, I do think so. And what about the majestic, awe-inspiring practice, the composition of tragedy? What is it after? Is the project, the intent of tragic composition, merely the gratification of spectators, as you think, or does it also strive valiantly not to say anything that is corrupt, though it may be pleasant and gratifying to them, and to utter in both speech and song anything that might be unpleasant, but beneficial, whether the spectators enjoy it or not? In which of these ways do you think tragedy is being composed? This much is obvious, Socrates, that it's more bent upon giving pleasure and upon gratifying the spectators. And weren't we saying just now that this sort of thing is flattery? Yes, we were. Well then, if one stripped away from the whole composition both melody, rhythm, and meter, does it turn out that what's left is only speeches? Necessarily. Aren't these speeches given to a large gathering of people? I agree. So poetry is a kind of popular harangue. Apparently. And such popular harangue would be oratory then. Or don't you think that poets practice oratory in the theaters? Yes, I do. So now we've discovered a popular oratory of a kind that's addressed to men, women, and children, slave and free alike. We don't much like it. We say it's a flattering sort. Yes, that's right. Very well. What about the oratory addressed to the Athenian people and to those in other cities composed of free men? What is our view of this kind? Do you think that orators always speak with regard to what's best? They always set their sights on making the citizens as good as possible through their speeches? Or are they also bent upon gratification of the citizens? And do they slight the common good for the sake of their own private good, and so keep company with the people trying solely to gratify them, without any thought at all for whether this will make them better or worse? This issue you're asking about isn't just a simple one, for there are those who say what they do because they do care for the citizens, and there are also those like the ones you're talking about. That's good enough, for if this matter really has two parts to it, then one part of it would be flattery, I suppose, and shameful public harangue, while the other, that of getting the souls of the citizens to be as good as possible, and of striving valiantly to say what is best, whether the audience will find it more pleasant or more unpleasant, is something admirable. But you've never seen this type of oratory, or if you can mention any orator of this sort, why haven't you let me also know who he is? No, by Zeus, I certainly can't mention any of our contemporary orators to you. Well then, can you mention anyone from former times through whom the Athenians have reputed to have become better after he began his public addresses, when previously they had been worse? I certainly don't know who this could be. What, don't they tell you that Themistocles proved to be a good man, and so did Cimon, Miltiades, and Pericles, who died just recently, and whom you've heard speak, too? Yes, Callicles, if the excellence you were speaking of earlier, the filling up of appetites, both one's own and those of others, is the true kind. But if this is not, and what we were compelled to agree on in our subsequent discussion is the true kind instead, that a man should satisfy those of his appetites that, when they are filled up, make him better, and not those that make him worse, and that this is a matter of craft, I don't see how I can say that any of these men has proved to be such a man. But if you look carefully, you'll find that they were. Let's examine the matter calmly and see whether any of these men has proved to be like that. Well then, won't the good man, the man who speaks with regard to what's best, say whatever he says not randomly, but with a view to something, just like the other craftsmen, each of whom keeps his own product in view, and so does not select and apply randomly what he applies, but so that he may give his product some shape? Take a look at painters, for instance, if you would, or house builders, or shipwrights, or any of the other craftsmen you like, and see how each one places what he does into a certain organization, and compels one thing to be suited for another and to fit to it until the entire object is put together in an organized and orderly way. The other craftsmen, too, including the ones we were mentioning just lately, the ones concerned with the body, physical trainers and doctors, no doubt give order and organization to the body. Do we agree that this is so or not? Now let's take it that way. So if a house gets to be organized and orderly, it would be a good one, and if it gets to be disorganized, it would be a terrible one. I agree. This holds true for a boat, too. Yes, and we surely take it to hold true for our bodies, too. Yes, we do. What about the soul? Will it be a good one if it gets to be disorganized, or if it gets to have a certain organization and order? Given what we said before, we must agree that this is so too. What names do we give to what comes into being in the body as a result of organization and order? You mean health and strength, presumably. Yes, I do. And which one do we give to what comes into being in the soul as a result of organization and order? Try to find and tell me its name, as in the case of the body. Why don't you say it yourself, Socrates? All right, if that pleases you more, I'll do so. And if you think I'm right, give your assent. If not, refute me and don't give way. I think that the name for the state of organization of the body is healthy, as a result of which health and the rest of the bodily excellences come into being in it. Is this so, or isn't it? It is. And the name for the state of organization and order of the soul is lawful and law, which lead people to become law-abiding and orderly, and these are justice and self-control. Do you assent to this or not? Let it be so. So this is what that skilled and good orator will look to when he applies to people's souls whatever speeches he makes, as well as all of his actions, and any gift he makes or any confiscation he carries out. He will always give his attention to how justice may come to exist in the souls of his fellow citizens, and injustice be gotten rid of, how self-control may come to exist there, and lack of discipline be gotten rid of, and how the rest of excellence may come into being there, and evil may depart. Do you agree or not? I do. Well, for what benefit is there, Callicles, in giving a body that's sick and in wretched shape lots of very pleasant food or drink or anything else, when it won't do the man a bit more good, or quite to the contrary, when by a fair reckoning it'll do him less good? Is that so? Let it be so. Yes, for I don't suppose that it profits a man to be alive with his body in a terrible condition, for this way of life, too, would be necessarily a wretched one, or wouldn't it be? Yes. Now, isn't it also true that doctors generally allow a person to fill up his appetites, to eat when he's hungry, for example, or drink when he's thirsty, as much as he wants to when he's in good health, and when he's sick they practically never allow him to fill himself with what he has an appetite for? Do you also go along with this point, at least? Yes, I do. And isn't it just the same way with the soul, my excellent friend? As long as it's corrupt, in that it's foolish, undisciplined, unjust, and impious, it should be kept away from its appetites, and not be permitted to do anything other than what will make it better. Do you agree or not? I agree. For this is no doubt better for the soul itself. Yes, it is. Now, isn't keeping it away from what it has an appetite for disciplining it? Yes. So to be disciplined is better for the soul than lack of discipline, which is what you yourself were thinking just now. I don't know what in the world you mean, Socrates. Ask somebody else. This fellow won't put up with being benefited, and with his undergoing the very thing the discussion's about, with being disciplined. And I couldn't care less about anything you say either. I gave you these answers just for Gorgias' sake. Very well. What do we do now? Are we breaking off in the midst of the discussion? That's for you to decide. They say it isn't permitted to give up in the middle of telling stories either. A head must be put on it so that it won't go about headless. Please answer the remaining questions too, so that our discussion may get its head. How unrelenting you are, Socrates. If you'll listen to me, you'll drop this discussion or carry it through with someone else. Who else is willing? Surely we mustn't leave the discussion incomplete. Couldn't you go through the discussion by yourself, either by speaking in your own person or by answering your own questions? In that case, Epicharmus' saying applies to me. I prove to be sufficient, being one man,
for what two men were saying before, but it looks as though I have no choice at all. Let's by all means do it that way, then. I suppose that all of us ought to be continuously eager to know what's true and what's false about the things we're talking about. That it should become clear is a good common to all. I'll go through the discussion then, and say how I think it is, and if any of you thinks that what I agree to with myself isn't so, you must object and refute me. For the things I say, I certainly don't say with any knowledge at all. No, I'm searching together with you, so that if my opponent clearly has a point, I'll be the first to concede it. I'm saying this, however, in case you think the discussion ought to be carried through to the end. If you don't want it to be, then let's drop it now and leave. No, Socrates, I don't think we should leave yet. You must finish the discussion. It seems to me that the others think so too. I myself certainly want to hear you go through the rest of it by yourself. All right, Gorgias. I myself would have been glad to continue my discussion with Callicles here until I returned him Amphion's speech for that of Zethus. Well, Callicles, since you're not willing to join me in carrying the discussion through to the end, please do listen to me and interrupt if you think I'm saying anything wrong. And if you refute me, I shan't be upset with you as you were with me. Instead, you'll go on record as my greatest benefactor. Speak on, my good friend, and finish it up by yourself. Listen, then, as I pick up the discussion from the beginning. Is the pleasant the same as the good? It isn't, as Callicles and I have agreed. Is the pleasant to be done for the sake of the good, or the good for the sake of the pleasant? The pleasant for the sake of the good. And pleasant is that by which, when it comes to be present in us, we feel pleasure, and good that by which, when it's present in us, we are good. That's right. But surely we are good, both we and everything else that's good, when some excellence has come to be present in us. Yes, I do think that that's necessarily so, Callicles. But the best way in which the excellence of each thing comes to be present in it, whether it's that of an artifact or of a body or a soul as well, or of any animal, is not just any old way, but is due to whatever organization, correctness, and craftsmanship is bestowed on each of them. Is that right? Yes, I agree. So it's due to organization that the excellence of each thing is something which is organized and has order. Yes, I'd say so. So, it's when a certain order, the proper one for each thing, comes to be present in it that it makes each of the things there are good. Yes, I think so. So also a soul, which has its own order, is better than a disordered one. Necessarily so. But surely one that has order is an orderly one. Of course it is. And an orderly soul is a self-controlled one. Absolutely. So a self-controlled soul is a good one. I, for one, can't say anything else beyond that, Callicles, my friend. If you can, please teach me. Say on, my good man. I say that if the self-controlled soul is a good one, then a soul that's been affected the opposite way of the self-controlled one is a bad one. And this, it's turned out, is the foolish and undisciplined one. That's right. And surely a self-controlled person would do what's appropriate with respect to both gods and human beings. For if he does what's inappropriate, he wouldn't be self-controlled. That's necessarily how it is. And of course, if he did what's appropriate with respect to human beings, he would be doing what's just, and with respect to gods, he would be doing what's pious, and one who does what's just and pious must necessarily be just and pious. That's so. Yes, and he would also necessarily be brave, for it's not like a self-controlled man to either pursue or avoid what isn't appropriate, but to avoid and pursue what he should, whether these are things to do, or people, or pleasures and pains, and to stand fast and endure them where he should. So it's necessarily very much the case, Callicles, that the self-controlled man, because he's just and brave and pious, as we've recounted, is a completely good man, that the good man does well and admirably whatever he does, and that the man who does well is blessed and happy, while the corrupt man, the one who does badly, is miserable. And this would be the one who's in the condition opposite to that of the self-controlled one, the undisciplined one, whom you were praising. So this is how I set down the matter, and I say that this is true, and if it is true, then a person who wants to be happy must evidently pursue and practice self-control. Each of us must flee away from lack of discipline as quickly as his feet will carry him, and must above all make sure that he has no need of being disciplined. But if he does have that need, either he himself or anyone in his house, either a private citizen or a whole city, he must pay his due and must be disciplined if he's to be happy. This is the target to which I think one should look in living, and in his actions he should direct all of his own affairs and those of his city to the end that justice and self-control will be present in one who is to be blessed. He should not allow his appetites to be undisciplined, or undertake to fill them up, a never-ending evil, and live the life of a marauder. Such a man could not be dear to another man or to a god, for he cannot be a partner, and where there's no partnership, there's no friendship. Yes, Callicles, wise men claim that partnership and friendship, orderliness, self-control, and justice hold together heaven and earth, and gods and men, and that is why they call this universe a world order, my friend, and not an undisciplined world disorder. I believe that you don't pay attention to these facts, even though you are a wise man in these matters. You've failed to notice that proportionate equality has great power among gods and men, and you suppose that you ought to practice getting the greater share. That's because you neglect geometry. Very well, we must either refute this argument and show that it's not the possession of justice and self-control that makes happy people happy, and the possession of evil that makes miserable people miserable, or else, if this is true, we must consider what the consequences are. These consequences are all those previous things, Callicles, the ones about which you asked me whether I was speaking in earnest when I said that a man should be his own accuser, or his son's or his friend's, if he's done anything unjust, and should use oratory for that purpose. Also, what you thought Polus was ashamed to concede is true after all, that doing what's unjust is as much more evil than suffering it is, as it is more shameful, and that a person who is to be an orator the right way should be just and have expert knowledge of what's just, the point Polus in his turn claimed Gorgias to have agreed to out of shame. That being so, let's examine what it is you're taking me to task for, and whether it's right or not. You say that I'm unable to protect either myself or any of my friends or relatives, or rescue them from the gravest of dangers, and that I'm at the mercy of the first comer, just as people without rights are, whether he wants to knock me on the jaw, to use that forceful expression of yours, or confiscate my property, or exile me from the city, or ultimately put me to death. To be in that position is, by your reasoning, the most shameful thing of all. As for what my own reasoning is, that's been told many times by now, but there's nothing to stop its being told once again. I deny, Callicles, that being knocked on the jaw unjustly is the most shameful thing, or that having my body or my purse cut is, and I affirm that to knock or cut me or my possessions unjustly is both more shameful and more evil, and at the same time that to rob or enslave me or to break into my house or, to sum up, to commit any unjust act at all against me and my possessions is both more evil and more shameful for the one who does these unjust acts than it is for me, the one who suffers them. These conclusions, at which we arrived earlier in our previous discussion, are, I'd say, held down and bound by arguments of iron and adamant, even if it's rather rude to say so. So it would seem, anyhow, and if you or someone more forceful than you won't undo them, then anyone who says anything other than what I'm now saying cannot be speaking well. And yet, for my part, my account is ever the same. I don't know how these things are, but no one I've ever met, as in this case, can say anything else without being ridiculous. So once more, I set it down that these things are so. And if they are, if injustice is the greatest of evils for the person committing it, and if that person's failure to pay what's due is a greater even still, if possible, than this one that's the greatest, what is the protection which would make a man who's unable to provide it for himself truly ridiculous? Isn't it the one that will turn away what harms us most? Yes, it's necessarily very much the case that this is the most shameful kind of protection not to be able to provide, either from oneself or for one's friends and relatives. And the second kind's the one that turns away the second greatest evil, and the third kind the one against the third greatest, and so on. The greater by its nature each evil is, the more admirable it is to be able to provide protection against it too, and the more shameful not to be able to. Is this the way it is, Callicles, or is it some other way? No, it's not any other way. Of these two things, then, of doing what's unjust and suffering it, we'd say that doing it is the greater evil and suffering it the lesser one. With what, then, might a man provide himself to protect himself so that he has both these benefits, the one that comes from not doing what's unjust and the one that comes from not suffering it? Is it power or wish? What I mean is this. Is it when a person doesn't wish to suffer what's unjust that he will avoid suffering it, or when he procures a power to avoid suffering it? When he procures a power. That is obvious, at least. And what about doing what's unjust? Is it when he doesn't wish to do it? Is that sufficient? Or he won't do it? Or should he procure a power and a craft for this too, so that unless he learns and practices it, he will commit injustice? Why don't you answer at least this question, Callicles? Do you think Polus and I were or were not correct in being compelled to agree in our previous discussions when we agreed that no one does what's unjust because he wants to, but that all who do so do it unwillingly? Let it be so, Socrates, so you can finish up your argument. So we should procure a certain power and craft against this too, evidently, so that we won't do what's unjust. That's right. What then is the craft by which we make sure that we don't suffer anything unjust, or as little as possible? Consider whether you think it's the one I do. This is what I think it is, that one ought either to be a ruler himself in his city, or even be a tyrant, or else to be a partisan of the regime in power. Do you see, Socrates, how ready I am to applaud you whenever you say anything right? I think that this statement of yours is right on the mark. Well, consider whether you think that the following statement of mine is a good one too. I think that the one man who's a friend of another most of all is the one whom the men of old and the wise call a friend, the one who's like the other. Do you think so too? Yes, I do. Now, if in the case of a tyrant who's a savage, uneducated ruler, there were in his city someone much better than he is, wouldn't the tyrant no doubt be afraid of him, and never be able to be a friend to him with all his heart? That's so. Nor would he, the tyrant, be a friend to a man much his inferior, if there were such a man, for the tyrant would despise him, and would never take a serious interest in him as a friend. That's true, too. This leaves only a man of like character, one who approves and disapproves of the same thing, and who is willing to be ruled by and be subject to the ruler, to be to such a man a friend worth mentioning. This man will have great power in that city, and no one will do him any wrong and get away with it. Isn't this so? Yes. So, if some young person in that city were to reflect, in what way would I be able to have great power and no one treat me unjustly? This evidently would be his way to go, to get himself accustomed from childhood on to like and dislike the same things as the master, and to make sure that he'll be as like him as possible. Isn't that so? Yes. Now, won't this man have achieved immunity to unjust treatment and great power in his city, as you people say? Oh, yes. And also immunity to unjust action. Or is that far from the case, since he'll be like the ruler who's unjust, and he'll have his great power at the ruler's side? For my part, I think that, quite to the contrary, in this way he'll be making sure he'll have the ability to engage in as much wrongdoing as possible, and to avoid paying what's due for doing it, right? Apparently. He'll have incurred the greatest evil when his soul is corrupt and mutilated on account of his imitation of the master and on account of his power. I don't know how you keep twisting our discussion in every direction, Socrates, or don't you know that this imitator will put to death, if he likes, your non-imitator and confiscate his property? I do know that, Callicles. I'm not deaf. I hear you say it, and heard Polus just now say it many times, and just about everyone else in the city. But now you listen to me, too. I say that yes, he'll kill him if he likes, but it'll be a wicked man killing one who's admirable and good. And isn't that just the most irritating thing about it? No, not for an intelligent person anyway, as our discussion points out. Or do you think that a man ought to make sure that his life be as long as possible, and that he practice those crafts that ever rescue us from dangers, like the oratory that you tell me to practice, the kind that preserves us in the law courts? Yes, and by Zeus, that's sound advice for you. Well, my excellent fellow, do you think that expertise in swimming is a grand thing? No, by Zeus, I don't. And it certainly does save people from death whenever they fall into the kind of situation that requires this expertise. But if you think that this expertise is a trivial one, I'll give you one more important than that of helmsmanship, which saves not only souls but also bodies and valuables from the utmost dangers, just as oratory does. This expertise is unassuming and orderly and does not make itself grand, posturing as though its accomplishment is so magnificent. But while its accomplishment is the same as that of the expertise practiced in the courts, it has earned 2 obols, I suppose, if it has brought people safely here from Aegina, and if it has brought them here from Egypt or the Pontus, then for that great service, having given safe passage to those I was mentioning just now, the man himself, his children, valuables, and womenfolk, and setting them ashore in the harbor, it has earned 2 drachmas, if that much. And the man who possesses the craft and who has accomplished these feats disembarks and goes for a stroll along the seaside and beside his ship with a modest air. For he is enough of an expert, I suppose, to conclude that it isn't clear which one of his fellow voyagers he has benefited by not letting them drown in the deep, and which ones he has harmed, knowing that they were no better in either body or soul when he set them ashore than they were when they embarked. So he concludes that if a man afflicted with serious, incurable physical diseases did not drown, this man is miserable for not dying, and has gotten no benefit from him. But if a man has many incurable diseases, and what is more valuable than his body, his soul, life for that man is not worth living, and he won't do him any favor if he rescues him from the sea, or from prison, or from anywhere else. He knows that for a corrupt person it's better not to be alive, for he necessarily lives badly. That is why it's not the custom for the helmsman to give himself glory even though he preserves us, and not the engineer either, who sometimes can preserve us no less well than a general or anyone else, not to mention a helmsman. For there are times when he preserves entire cities. You don't think that he's on a level with the advocate, do you? And yet, if he wanted to say what you people do, Callicles, glorifying his occupation, he would smother you with speeches telling you urgently that people should become engineers, because nothing else amounts to anything, and the speech would make his point. But you nonetheless despise him and his craft, and you'd call him engineer as a term of abuse. You'd be unwilling either to give your daughter to his son or take his daughter yourself. And yet, given your grounds for applauding your own activities, what just reason do you have for despising the engineer and the others whom I was mentioning just now? I know that you'd say you're a better man, one from better stock, but if better does not mean what I take it to mean, and if, instead, to preserve yourself and what belongs to you, no matter what sort of person you happen to be, is what excellence is, then your reproach against engineer, doctor, and all the other crafts which have been devised to preserve us will prove to be ridiculous. But, my blessed man, please see whether what's noble and what's good isn't something other than preserving and being preserved. Perhaps one who is truly a man should stop thinking about how long he will live. He should not be attached to life, but should commit those concerns to the God, and believe the women who say that not one single person can escape fate. He should thereupon give consideration to how he might live the part of his life still before him as well as possible. Should it be by becoming like the regime under which he lives? In that case, you should now be making yourself as much like the Athenian people as possible, if you expect to endear yourself to them and have great power in the city. Please see whether this profits you and me, my friend, so that what they say happens to the Thessalian witches when they pull down the moon won't happen to us. Our choice of this kind of civic power will cost us what we hold most dear. If you think that some person or other will hand you a craft of the sort that will give you great power in this city, while you are unlike the regime, whether for better or for worse, then in my opinion, Callicles, you're not well advised. You mustn't be their imitator, but be naturally like them in your own person, if you expect to produce any genuine result toward winning the friendship of the Athenian people, and yes, by Zeus, of Demos the son of Pyrilampes to boot. Whoever then turns out to be most like these men, he'll make you a politician in the way you desire to be one, and an orator too. For each group of people takes delight in speeches that are given in its own character, and resents those given in an alien manner. Unless you say something else, my dear friend, can we say anything in reply to this, Callicles? I don't know how it is that I think you're right, Socrates, but the thing that happens to most people has happened to me. I'm not really convinced by you. It's your love for the people, Callicles, existing in your soul, that stands against me. But if we closely examine these same matters often and in a better way, you'll be convinced. Please recall that we said that there were two practices for caring for a particular thing, whether it's the body or the soul. One of them deals with pleasures and the other with what's best, and doesn't gratify it but struggles against it. Isn't this how we distinguished them then? Yes, that's right. Now one of them, the one dealing with pleasure, is ignoble and is actually nothing but flattery, right? Let it be so if you like. Whereas the other one, the one that aims to make the thing we're caring for, whether it's a body or a soul, as good as possible, is the more noble one. Yes, that's so. Shouldn't we then attempt to care for the city and its citizens with the aim of making the citizens themselves as good as possible? For without this, as we discovered earlier, it does no good to provide any other service if the intentions of those who are likely to make a great deal of money or take a position of rule over people or some other position of power aren't admirable and good. Are we to put this down as true? Certainly, if that pleases you more. Suppose then, Callicles, that you and I were about to take up the public business of the city, and we called on each other to carry out building projects, the major works of construction, walls or ships or temples. Would we have to examine and check ourselves closely first to see if we are or are not experts in the building craft, and whom we've learned it from? Would we have to, or wouldn't we? Yes, we would. And second, we'd have to check, wouldn't we, whether we've ever built a work of construction in private business, for a friend of ours, say, or for ourselves, and whether this structure is admirable or disgraceful. And if we discover on examination that our teachers have proved to be good and reputable ones, and that the works of construction built by us under their guidance were numerous and admirable, then those built by us on our own after we left our teachers were numerous too, then, if that were our situation, we'd be wise to proceed to public projects. But if we could point out neither teacher nor construction works, either none at all or else many worthless ones, it would surely be stupid to undertake public projects and to call each other on them too. Shall we say that this point is right or not? Yes, we shall. Isn't it so in all cases, especially if we attempted to take up public practice and call on each other, thinking we were capable doctors? I'd have examined you, and you me, I suppose. Well now, by the gods, what is Socrates' own physical state of health? Has there ever been anyone else, slave or free man, whose delivery from illness has been due to Socrates? And I'd be considering other similar questions about you, I suppose. And if we found no one whose physical improvements had been due to us, among neither visitors nor townspeople, neither a man nor a woman, then, by Zeus, Callicles, wouldn't it be truly ridiculous that people should advance to such a height of folly that, before producing many mediocre as well as many successful results in private practice, and before having had sufficient expertise at the craft, they should attempt to learn pottery on the big jar, as that saying goes, and attempt both to take up public practice themselves and to call on others like them to do so as well? Don't you think it would be stupid to proceed like that? Yes, I do. But now, my most excellent fellow, seeing that you yourself are just now beginning to be engaged in the business of the city, and you call on me and take me to task for not doing so, shall we not examine each other? Well now, has Callicles ever improved any of the citizens? Is there anyone who was wicked before, unjust, undisciplined, and foolish, a visitor or townsman, a slave or free man, who, because of Callicles, has turned out admirable and good? Tell me, Callicles, what will you say if somebody asks you these scrutinizing questions? Whom will you say you've made a better person through your association with him? Do you shrink back from answering? If there even is anything you produced while still in private practice before attempting a public career? You love to win, Socrates. But it's not for love of winning that I'm asking you. It's rather because I really do want to know the way, whatever it is, in which you suppose the city's business ought to be conducted among us. Now that you've advanced to the business of the city, are we to conclude that you're devoted to some objective other than that we, the citizens, should be as good as possible? Haven't we agreed many times already that this is what a man active in politics should be doing? Have we or haven't we? Please answer me. Yes, we have. I'll answer for you. So, if this is what a good man should make sure about for his own city, think back now to those men whom you were mentioning a little earlier, and tell me whether you still think that Pericles, Cimon, Miltiades, and Themistocles have proved to be good citizens. Yes, I do. So, if they were good ones, each of them was obviously making the citizens better than they were before. Was he or wasn't he? Yes. So when Pericles first began giving speeches among the people, the Athenians were worse than when he gave his last ones. Presumably. Not presumably, my good man. It necessarily follows from what we've agreed, if he really was a good citizen. So what? Nothing, but tell me this as well. Are the Athenians said to have become better because of Pericles, or quite to the contrary? Are they said to have been corrupted by him? That's what I hear, anyhow, that Pericles made the Athenians idle and cowardly, chatterers and money-grubbers, since he was the first to institute wages for them. The people you hear say this have cauliflower ears, Socrates. Here, though, is something I'm not just hearing. I do know clearly, and you do too, that at first Pericles had a good reputation, and when they were worse, the Athenians never voted to convict him in any shameful deposition. But after he had turned them into admirable and good people near the end of his life, they voted to convict Pericles of embezzlement and came close to condemning him to death, because they thought he was a wicked man, obviously. Well, did that make Pericles a bad man? A man like that, who cared for donkeys or horses or cattle, would at least look bad if he showed these animals kicking, butting, and biting him because of their wildness, when they had been doing nothing of these things when he took them over. Or don't you think that any caretaker of any animal is a bad one who will show his animals to be wilder than when he took them over, when they were gentler? Do you think so or not? Oh yes, so I may gratify you. In that case, gratify me now with your answer too. Is man one of the animals too? Of course he is. Wasn't Pericles a caretaker of men? Yes. Well, shouldn't he, according to what we agreed just now, have turned them out more just instead of more unjust, if, while he cared for them, he really was good at politics? Yes, he should have. Now, as Homer says, the just are gentle. What do you say? Don't you say the same? Yes. But Pericles certainly showed them to be wilder than they were when he took them over, and that toward himself, the person he'd least want this to happen to. Do you want me to agree with you? Yes, if you think what I say is true. So be it then. And if wilder, then both more unjust and worse? So be it. So, on this reasoning, Pericles wasn't good at politics. You at least deny that he was. By Zeus, you do too, given what you were agreeing to. Let's go back to Cimon. Tell me, didn't the people he was serving ostracize him so that they wouldn't hear his voice for 10 years? And didn't they do the very same thing to Themistocles, punishing him with exile besides? And didn't they vote to throw Miltiades of Marathon fame into the pit? And if it hadn't been for the Prytanes, he would have been thrown in? And yet these things would not have happened to these men if they were good men, as you say they were. At least it's not the case that good drivers are the ones who at the start don't fall out of their chariots, but who do fall out after they've cared for their horses and become better drivers themselves. This doesn't happen either in driving or in any other work. Or do you think it does? No, I don't. So it looks as though our earlier statements were true, and that we don't know any man who has proved to be good at politics in this city. You are agreeing that none of our present-day ones has, though you said that some of those of times past had, and you gave preference to these men. but these have been shown to be on equal footing with the men of today. The result is that if these men were orators, they practiced neither the true oratory, for in that case they wouldn't have been thrown out, nor the flattering kind. But surely, Socrates, any accomplishment that any of our present-day men produces is a far cry from the sort of accomplishments produced by any one of the others you choose. No, my strange friend, I'm not criticizing these men either, insofar as they were servants of the city. I think rather that they proved to be better servants than the men of today, and more capable than they of satisfying the city's appetites. But the truth is that in redirecting its appetites and not giving in to them, using persuasion or constraint to get the citizens to become better, they were really not much different from our contemporaries. That alone is the task of a good citizen. Yes, I too agree with you that they were more clever than our present leaders at supplying ships and walls and dockyards and many other things of the sort. Now, you and I are doing an odd thing in our conversation. The whole time we've been discussing, we constantly keep drifting back to the same point, neither of us recognizing what the other is saying. For my part, I believe you have agreed many times and recognize that after all this subject of ours has two parts, both in the case of the body and the soul. The one part of it is the servient one, enabling us to provide our bodies with food whenever they're hungry, or with drink whenever they're thirsty, and whenever they're cold, with clothes, wraps, shoes, and other things our bodies come to have an appetite for. I am purposely using the same examples in speaking to you so that you'll understand them more easily. For these, I think you agree, are the very things a shopkeeper, importer, or producer can provide, a bread baker or pastry chef, a weaver or cobbler or tanner. So it isn't at all surprising that such a person should think himself and be thought by others to be a caretaker of the body. But everyone who doesn't know that over and above all these practices there's a craft, that of gymnastics and medicine, that really does care for the body and is entitled to rule all these crafts and use their products because of its knowledge of what food or drink is good or bad for bodily excellence, a knowledge which all of the others lack. That's why the other crafts are slavish and servient and illiberal, and why gymnastics and medicine are by rights mistresses over them. Now, when I say that these same things hold true of the soul, too, I think you sometimes understand me, and you agree as one who knows what I'm saying. But then a little while later you come along saying that there have been persons who've proved to be admirable and good citizens in the city, and when I ask who they are, you seem to me to produce people who, in the area of politics, are very much the same sort you would produce if I asked you, who have proved to be or are good caretakers of bodies? And you replied in all seriousness, Therion, the bread baker, and Mithachius, the author of the book on Sicilian pastry baking, and Sarambus, the shopkeeper, because these men have proved to be wonderful caretakers of bodies, the first by providing wonderful loaves of bread, the second pastry, and the third wine. Perhaps you'd be upset if I said to you, my man, you don't have the slightest understanding of gymnastics. The men you're mentioning to me are servants, satisfiers of appetites. They have no understanding whatever of anything that's admirable and good in these cases. They'll fill and fatten people's bodies if they get the chance, and besides that, destroy their original flesh as well, all the while receiving their praise. These people, in their turn, thanks to their inexperience, will lay the blame for their illnesses and the destruction of their original flesh, not on those who threw the pastries, but on any people who happened to be with them at the time, giving them advice. Yes, when the earlier stuffing had come back, bringing sickness in its train much later, then, because it's proved to be unhealthy, they'll blame these people and scold them and do something bad to them if they can. And they'll sing the praises of those earlier people, the ones responsible for their ills. Right now you're operating very much like that too, Callicles. You sing the praises of those who threw parties for these people and who feasted them lavishly with what they had an appetite for. And they say that they have made the city great. But that the city is swollen and festering, thanks to those earlier leaders, that they don't notice. For they filled the city with harbors and dockyards, walls and tribute payments, and such trash as that, but did so without justice and self-control.
So when that fit of sickness comes on, they'll blame their advisers of the moment and sing the praises of Themistocles and Cimon and Pericles, the ones who are to blame for their ills. Perhaps, if you're not careful, they'll lay their hands on you and on my friend Alcibiades when they lose not only what they gained, but what they had originally as well, even though you aren't responsible for their ills, but perhaps accessories to them. And yet there's a foolish business that I, for one, both see happening now and hear about in connection with our early leaders. For I notice that whenever the city lays its hands on one of its politicians, because he does what's unjust, they resent it and complain indignantly that they're suffering terrible things. They've done many good things for the city, and so they're being unjustly brought to ruin by it, so their argument goes. But that's completely false. Not a single city leader could ever be brought to ruin by the very city he's the leader of. It looks as though those who profess to be politicians are just like those who profess to be sophists. For sophists, too, even though they are wise in other matters, do this absurd thing. While they claim to be teachers of excellence, they frequently accuse their students of doing them wrong, depriving them of their fees, and withholding other forms of thanks from them, even though the students have been well served by them. Yet what could be a more illogical business than this statement, that people who've become good and just, whose injustice has been removed by their teacher, and who have come to possess justice, should wrong him, something they can't do? Don't you think that's absurd, my friend? You've made me deliver a real popular harangue, Callicles, because you aren't willing to answer. And you couldn't speak unless somebody answered you? Evidently I could. Anyhow, I am stretching my speeches out at length now, since you're unwilling to answer me. But, my good man, tell me, by the God of friendship, don't you think it's illogical that someone who says he's made someone else good should find fault with that person, charging that he, whom he himself made to become and to be good, is, after all, wicked? Yes, I do think so. Don't you hear people who say they're educating people for excellence and saying things like that? Yes, I do. But why would you mention completely worthless people? Why would you talk about those people who, although they say they're the city's leaders and devoted to making it as good as possible, turn around and accuse it, when the time comes, of being the most wicked? Do you think they're any different from these others? Yes, my blessed man, they are one and the same, the sophist and the orator, or nearly so, and pretty similar, as I was telling Polus. But because you don't see this, you suppose that one of them, oratory, is something wonderful, while you sneer at the other. In actuality, however, sophistry is more to be admired than oratory, insofar as legislation is more admirable than the administration of justice, and gymnastics more than medicine. And I, for one, should have supposed that public speakers and sophists are the only people not in a position to charge the creatures they themselves educate with being wicked to them, or else they simultaneously accuse themselves as well, by this same argument, of having entirely failed to benefit those whom they say they benefit. Isn't this so? Yes, it is. And if what I'm saying is true, then they alone, no doubt, are in a position to offer on terms of honor the benefit they provide, without charge, as is reasonable. For somebody who had another benefit conferred on him, one who, for example, had been turned into a fast runner by a physical trainer, could perhaps deprive the man of his compensation if the trainer offered him that benefit on his honor, instead of agreeing on a fixed fee and taking his money as closely as possible to the time he imparts the speed. For I don't suppose that it's by slowness that people act unjustly, but by injustice, right? Yes. So if somebody removes that very thing, injustice, he shouldn't have any fear of being treated unjustly. For him alone is it safe to offer this benefit on terms of honor, if it's really true that one can make people good. Isn't that so? I agree. This, then, is evidently why there's nothing shameful in taking money for giving advice concerning other matters, such as house building or other crafts. Yes, evidently. But as for this activity, which is concerned with how a person ought to be as good as possible and manage his own house or his city in the best possible way, it's considered shameful to refuse to give advice concerning it unless somebody pays you money, right? Yes.
For it's clear that what accounts for this is the fact that of all the benefits, this one alone makes the one who's had good done to him have the desire to do good in return, so that we think it's a good sign of someone's having done good by conferring this benefit, that he'll have good done to him in return, and not a good sign if he won't. Is this how it is? It is. Now, please describe for me precisely the type of care for the city to which you are calling me. Is it that of striving valiantly with the Athenians to make them as good as possible, like a doctor? Or is it like one ready to serve them and to associate with them for their gratification? Tell me the truth, Callicles, for just as you began by speaking candidly to me, it's only fair that you should continue speaking your mind. Tell me now, too, well and nobly. In that case, I say it's like one ready to serve. So, noblest of men, you're calling on me to be ready to flatter. Yes, if you find it more pleasant not to mince words, Socrates, because if you don't do this, I hope you won't say what you've said many times, that anyone who wants to will put me to death. That way I, too, won't repeat my claim that it would be a wicked man doing this to a good man, and don't say that he'll confiscate any of my possessions either, so I won't reply that when he's done so he won't know how to use them. Rather, just as he unjustly confiscated them from me, so, having gotten them, he'll use them unjustly too, and if unjustly, shamefully, and if shamefully, badly. How sure you seem to me to be, Socrates, that not even one of these things will happen to you. You think that you live out of their way, and that you wouldn't be brought to court, perhaps, by some very corrupt and mean man. In that case, I really am a fool, Callicles, if I don't suppose that anything might happen to anybody in this city. But I know this well, that if I do come into court involved in one of those perils which you mention, the man who brings me in will be a wicked man, for no good man would bring in a man who is not a wrongdoer. And it wouldn't be at all strange if I were to be put to death. Would you like me to tell you my reason for expecting this? Yes, I would. I believe I'm one of a few Athenians, so as not to say I'm the only one, but the only one among our contemporaries, to take up the true political craft and practice the true politics. This is because the speeches I make on each occasion do not aim at gratification, but at what's best. They don't aim at what's most pleasant, and because I'm not willing to do those clever things you recommend, I won't know what to say in court. And the same account I applied to Polus comes back to me, for I'll be judged the way a doctor would be judged by a jury of children if a pastry chef were to bring accusations against him. Think about what a man like that, taken captive among these people, could say in his defense, if somebody were to accuse him and say, "Children, this man has worked many great evils on you, yes, on you. He destroys the youngest among you by cutting and burning them, and by slimming them down and choking them, he confuses them. He gives them the most bitter potions to drink, and forces hunger and thirst on them. He doesn't feast you on a great variety of sweets the way I do. What do you think a doctor caught in such an evil predicament could say? Or if he should tell them the truth and say, 'Yes, children, I was doing all these things in the interest of health,' how big an uproar do you think such judges would make? Wouldn't it be a loud one? Perhaps so. I should think so. Don't you think he'd be at a total loss as to what he should say? Yes, he would be. That's the sort of thing I know would happen to me, too, if I came into court. For I won't be able to point out any pleasures that I've provided for them, ones they believe to be services and benefits, while I envy neither those who provide them nor the ones for whom they're provided. Nor will I be able to say what's true if someone charges that I ruin younger people by confusing them, or abuse older ones by speaking bitter words against them in public or private. I won't be able to say, that is, 'Yes, I say and do all these things in the interest of justice, my honored judges,' to use that expression you people use, nor anything else. So presumably I'll get whatever comes my way. Do you think, Socrates, that a man in such a position in his city, a man who's unable to protect himself, is to be admired? Yes, Callicles, as long as he has that one thing that you've often agreed he should have, as long as he has protected himself against having spoken or done anything unjust relating to either men or gods. For this is the self-protection that you and I often have agreed avails the most. Now, if someone were to refute me and prove that I am unable to provide this protection for myself or for anyone else, I would feel shame at being refuted, whether this happened in the presence of many or of a few, or just between the two of us. And if I were to be put to death for lack of this ability, I really would be upset. But if I came to my end because of a deficiency in flattering oratory, I know that you'd see me bear my death with ease. For no one who isn't totally bereft of reason and courage is afraid to die. Doing what's unjust is what he's afraid of. For of all evils, the ultimate is that of arriving in Hades with one's soul stuffed full of unjust actions. If you like, I'm willing to give you an account showing that this is so. All right, since you've gone through the other things, go through this too. Give ear, then, as they put it, to a very fine account. You'll think that it's a mere tale, I believe, although I think it's an account, for what I'm about to say I will tell you is true. As Homer tells it, after Zeus, Poseidon, and Plato took over the sovereignty from their father, they divided it among themselves. Now there was a law concerning human beings during Cronus' time, one that gods even now continue to observe, that when a man who has lived a just and pious life comes to his end, he goes to the Isles of the Blessed, to make his abode in complete happiness, beyond the reach of evils. But when one who has lived in an unjust and godless way dies, he goes to the prison of payment and retribution, the one they call Tartarus. In Cronus' time, and even more recently during Zeus's tenure of sovereignty, these men faced living judges while they were still alive, who judged them on the day they were going to die. Now the cases were badly decided, so Plato and the keepers from the Isles of the Blessed came to Zeus and told him that people were undeservingly making their way in both directions. So Zeus said, "All right, I'll put a stop to that. The cases are being badly decided at this time because those being judged are judged fully dressed. They're being judged while they're still alive. Many," he said, "whose souls are wicked are dressed in handsome bodies, good stock and wealth, and when their judgment takes place, they have many witnesses appear to testify that they have lived just lives. Now the judges are awestruck by these things, and pass judgment at a time when they themselves are fully dressed too, having put their eyes and ears and their whole bodies up as screens in front of their souls. All these things, their own clothing and that of those being judged, have proved to be obstructive to them. What we must do first," he said, "is to stop them from knowing their death ahead of time. Now they do have that knowledge. This is something that Prometheus has already been told to put a stop to. Next, they must be judged when they're stripped naked of all these things, for they should be judged when they are dead. The judge, too, should be naked and dead, and with only his soul he should study only the soul of each person immediately upon his death, when he's isolated from all his kinsmen, and has left behind on earth all that adornment, so that the judgment may be a just one. Now I, realizing this before you did, have already appointed my sons as judges, 2 from Asia, Minos and Rhadamanthus, and 1 from Europe, Aetius. After they've died, they'll serve as judges in the meadow, at the 3-way crossing from which the 2 roads go on, the one to the Isles of the Blessed, and the other to Tartarus. Rhadamanthus will judge the people from Asia, and Aetius those from Europe. I'll give seniority to Minos to render final judgment if the other 2 are at all perplexed, so that the judgment concerning the passage of humankind may be as just as possible. This, Callicles, is what I've heard, and I believe that it's true, and on the basis of these accounts I conclude that something like this takes place. Death, I think, is actually nothing but the separation of 2 things from each other, the soul and the body. So, after they're separated, each of them stays in a condition not much worse than what it was in when the person was alive. The body retains its nature, and the care it had received as well as the things that have happened to it are all evident. If a man had a body, for instance, which was large, either by nature or through nurture or both, while he was alive, his corpse after he has died is large too, and if he was fat, so is the corpse of the dead man, and so on. And if a man took care to grow his hair long, his corpse will have long hair too. And again, if a man had been a criminal, whipped for his crime, and showed scars, traces of beatings on his body inflicted by whips or other blows while he was alive, his body can be seen to have these marks too when he is dead. And if a man's limbs were broken or twisted while he was alive, these very things will be evident too when he is dead. In a word, however a man treated his body while he was alive, all the marks of that treatment, or most of them, are evident for some time even after he is dead. And I think that the same thing, therefore, holds true also for the soul, Callicles. All that's in the soul is evident after it has been stripped naked of the body, both things that are natural to it and things that have happened to it, things that the person came to have in his soul as a result of his pursuit of each objective. So when they arrive before their judge, the people from Asia before Rhadamanthus brings them to a halt and studies each person's soul without knowing who it is. He's often got a hold of the great king or some other king or potentate, and notice that there's nothing sound in his soul, but that it's been thoroughly whipped and covered with scars. The results of acts of perjury and of injustice, things that each of his actions has stamped upon his soul. Everything was warped as a result of deception and pretense, and nothing was straight, all because the soul had been nurtured without truth, and he saw that the soul was full of distortion and ugliness due to license and luxury, arrogance and incontinence in its actions. And when he had seen it, he dismissed this soul in dishonor straight to the guardhouse, where it went to await suffering its appropriate fate. It is appropriate for everyone who is subject to punishment rightly inflicted by another, either to become better and profit from it, or else to be made an example for others, so that when they see him suffering whatever it is he suffers, they may be afraid and become better. Those who are benefited, who are made to pay their due by gods and men, are the ones whose errors are curable. Even so, their benefit comes to them, both here and in Hades, by way of pain and suffering, for there is no other possible way to get rid of injustice. From among those who have committed the ultimate wrongs, and who, because of such crimes, have become incurable, come the ones who are made examples of. These persons themselves no longer derive any profit from their punishment, because they're incurable. Others, however, do profit from it when they see them undergoing for all time the most grievous, intensely painful, and frightening sufferings for their errors, simply strung up there in the prison in Hades as examples, visible warnings to unjust men who are ever arriving. I claim that Archelaus, too, will be one of their number, if what Polus says is true, and anyone else who's a tyrant like him. I suppose that in fact the majority of these examples have come from the ranks of tyrants, kings, potentates, and those active in the affairs of cities, for these people commit the most grievous and impious errors because they're in a position to do so. Homer, too, is a witness on these matters, for he has depicted those undergoing eternal punishment in Hades as kings and potentates, Tantalus, Sisyphus, and Titius. As for Thersites and any other private citizen who was wicked, no one has depicted him as surrounded by the most grievous punishments, as though he were incurable. He wasn't in that position, I suppose, and for that reason he's also happier than those who did. The fact is, Callicles, that those persons who become extremely wicked do come from the ranks of the powerful, although there's certainly nothing to stop good men from turning up even among them, and those who do turn up deserve to be enthusiastically admired. For it's a difficult thing, Callicles, and one that merits much praise, to live your whole life justly when you've found yourself having ample freedom to do what's unjust. Few are those who prove to be like that. But since there have proved to be such people, both here and elsewhere, I suppose that there'll be others too, men admirable and good in that excellence of justly carrying out whatever is entrusted to them. One of these, Aristides, the son of Lysimachus, has proved to be very illustrious indeed, even among the rest of the Greeks. But the majority of our potentates, my good man, proved to be bad. So, as I was saying, when Rhadamanthus the judge gets hold of someone like that, he doesn't know a thing about him, neither who he is nor who his people are, except that he's somebody wicked. And once he's noticed that, he brands the man as either curable or incurable, as he sees fit, and dismisses the man to Tartarus. And once the man has arrived there, he undergoes the appropriate sufferings. Once in a while he inspects another soul, one who has lived a pious life, one devoted to truth, the soul of a private citizen or someone else especially, and I at any rate say this, Callicles, that of a philosopher who has minded his own affairs and hasn't been meddlesome in the course of his life. He admires the man and sends him off to the Isles of the Blessed. And Aetius, too, does the very same things. Each of them, with staff in hand, renders judgments, and Minos is seated to oversee them. He alone holds the golden scepter, the way Homer's Odysseus claims to have seen him, holding his golden scepter, decreeing right among the dead. For my part, Callicles, I'm convinced by these accounts, and I think about how I'll reveal to the judge a soul that's as healthy as it can be. So I disregard the things held in honor by the majority of people, and by practicing truth, I really try, to the best of my ability, to be and to live as a very good man, and when I die, to die like that. And I call on all other people as well, as far as I can, and you especially I call on in response to your call, to this way of life, this contest, that I hold to be worth all the other contests in this life. And I take you to task, because you won't be able to come to protect yourself when you appear at the trial and judgment I was talking about just now. When you come before that judge, the son of Aegina, and he takes hold of you and brings you to trial, your mouth will hang open, and you'll get dizzy there just as much as I will here, and maybe somebody will give you a demeaning knock on the jaw and throw all sorts of dirt at you. Maybe you think this account is told as an old wives' tale, and you'll feel contempt for it, and it certainly wouldn't be a surprising thing to feel contempt for it if we could look for and somehow find one better and truer than it. As it is, you see that there are 3 of you, the wisest of the Greeks of today, you, Polus, and Gorgias, and you're not able to prove that there's any other life one should live than the one which will clearly turn out to be advantageous in that world, too. But among so many arguments, this one alone survives refutation and remains steady, that doing what's unjust is more to be guarded against than suffering it, and that it's not seeming to be good, but being good that a man should take care of more than anything, both in his public and his private life, and that if a person proves to be bad in some respect, he is to be disciplined, and that the second best thing after being just is to become just by paying one's due, by being disciplined, and that every form of flattery, both the form concerned with oneself and that concerned with others, whether there are few or many, is to be avoided, and that oratory and every other activity is always to be used in support of what's just. So, listen to me and follow me to where I am, and when you've come here, you'll be happy both during life and at its end, as the account indicates. Let someone despise you as a fool and throw dirt on you if he likes, and yes, by Zeus, confidently let him deal you that demeaning blow. Nothing terrible will happen to you if you really are an admirable and good man, one who practices excellence. And then, after we've practiced it together, then at last, if we think we should, we'll turn to politics, or then we'll deliberate about whatever subject we please, when we're better at deliberating than we are now. For it's a shameful thing for us, being in the condition we appear to be in at present, when we never think the same about the same subjects, the most important one at that, to sound off as though we're somebodies. That's how far behind in education we've fallen. So let's use the account that has now been disclosed to us as our guide, one that indicates to us that this way of life is the best, to practice justice and the rest of excellence both in life and in death. Let us follow it then, and call on others to do so too, and let's not follow the one that you believe in and call on me to follow, for that one is worthless, Callicles.